Okay, so next up we're running not too behind time. So next up we have Globalizing the Spaces of Boxed Water, or Towards a Convivial Spatial Politics of the Ocean, with Mohammed Arju, Hugh Govan, and Professor Muniba Isaacs. And I'm wondering if everybody's ready for me to introduce. I'll do some bios for now. So Mohammed Arju is a conservation practitioner based in South Asia. He is a passionate advocate for decolonizing conservation. He leads a social enterprise to promote the leadership of artisanal fishers and coastal communities, and is currently the communications coordinator of the ICCA Consortium, which is the international association supporting the global movement for indigenous peoples and local communities' collective territories of life. He also serves as a board member for the Society for Conservation Biology Marine section and the Social Science Working Group. Hugh Govan was born in Scotland, raised in Spain, and has lived and worked in the Solomon Islands, Central South America, and throughout the Pacific, and has been settled in Fiji for 13 years. He was going to be with us today, but I think is calling in from Brussels on account of the COVID restrictions that have emerged across Europe this week. He advises the locally managed marine area network in Asia and the Pacific, and has refined and extended community-driven approaches to resource management from the Pacific into a global phenomenon. He works in policy as well as practice at all scales, particularly in Melanesia and the island Pacific, articulating the region's overarching ocean policy. And Muniba Isaacs is professor at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. Her research follows social and political processes of fisheries reform in South Africa, and mainly small-scale fisheries policy in South Africa. She is the regional coordinator of the Global Partnership for Future of Small-Scale Fisheries, called Too Big to Ignore, and engages in participatory action research. She's, amongst other things, chaired the Human Dimension Working Group on Integrated Marine Biogeochemistry, of Ecosystem Research, and the UN Committee on Food Security's high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, and the role of sustainable fisheries in aquaculture and food security and nutrition. So I'm hoping that everybody's here. Hello. So good to see you all together on one screen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, great. So I'm sorry that we're running slightly late. We'll be hand over to Hugh and Mohammed to start with, who are doing a shared contribution, and then on to Muniba, and then we'll open up for some questions. So over to you guys, Hugh and Mohammed.
Oh, well, maybe I'll kick off. We'll try and bounce backwards and forwards. As you mentioned, I was brought up in Spain, but I was fortunate enough after I graduated in marine biology to be educated in the real world of Solomon Islands communities. I was in Solomons for 6 years and worked with hundreds of communities there, and had to reprogram my brain to a great extent from what I was being gently told there. And so after I worked in other parts of the world, I was very keen to go back to the Pacific to work further when I had a little bit more to offer from my side. And I joined a wave of, how would I call it, community conservation that started about 20 years ago, in which NGOs and governments to some extent started supporting communities to do resource management. And this has been touted as a worldwide success. The locally managed marine area, LMMAs, are quite well known in conservation circles. And indeed, up to 1,000 communities have been reached with these ideas, and possibly maybe improving their management to this day. But over that time, yet again, communities educated me, and one thing that was very clear is that although these numbers sound very high, there are tens of thousands of communities in the Pacific, and so in fact less than 10% were being reached after 20 years by these sort of approaches. But more importantly, the fact was that communities had always been equipped to manage their resources. Sure, they were facing new challenges, challenges for which tradition maybe didn't equip them so well, but they did have the basic ingredient, and the basic ingredient wasn't being facilitated by an outside NGO or getting information from the Western world. The basic ingredient seemed to me, and I think is to this day, the de facto or even in some cases legal rights which communities have in the South Pacific over their resources. And so they are actually already able to defend their resources from outsiders that are encroaching on them. They can defend them better or worse depending on how well equipped the encroaching parties are. In general, they have stopped the tragedy of the commons in terms of the global commons, because people can't just enter their areas and take what they want. They have to negotiate access and negotiate what they can take to some extent. So this is probably the first secret ingredient, or the ingredient that was screaming out to be recognized, and which NGOs haven't adequately recognized and governments don't recognize so much. And if they do, in fact, I think they're scared of this, because the power of these community rights is power that governments can't exert over the communities. So the communities can look after their resources, and they can to some extent plan their lives up to the extent that government lets them or doesn't interfere. So I think that might be a good point to see Mohammed's contribution.
Yeah, thank you, Ho. And good to meet you, although virtually, Professor Muniba. And I was listening to the previous panel, and at the very last points of the previous panel, there is a discussion that it's important who gets to decide, because the decision on a very large part, of course, depend on who gets to decide. And of course, now that we have all these methods and approaches about community-based conservation or participatory conservation and approaches of inclusive conservation. But where I am from, in North Indian Ocean, in Bay of Bengal region, our experience is at the end of the day, if the decision, the determination is not coming from the community, the immediate users of the environmental commons, the local communities, for example, the fishing communities, and then these participatory processes, the inclusiveness of conservation even doesn't translated into any difference than it was before. Because what our experience is in, for example, in Indian subcontinent, in Bengal, is we had significant decommunization, privatization of environmental commons during the colonial era, and it was not, it was not, in a way, not settler colonialism in Bengal, but the total colonial business was about deindustrialize the local economy, underdeveloping our communities, and at our expense, building the wealth in Europe. So what happened, I'm not discussing the past just to look into the past, because this is about now. This is how the present land administration and total regime of governance of environmental commons was built in this part of the world. So, for example, now that we are at Lisbon virtually, it reminds me of something, how the total justification of this type of decisions made by outsider, the total colonial management of natural resources happened. When the British East India Company, it was a NGO in a way, non-government organization. When they came in Bengal, they took over fast the civil administration and the revenue administration, and they handed over all the lands that included the water, the riverine areas and the inshore areas to a new class of tax collector who owned the land. And unlike the previous tax collectors in Mughal administration or in Sultan administration in local governance, these jamindars were not the proprietor of lands. So I think my point is, now that we have this new global project run by the most unaccountable and non-transparent NGOs in the world, this new special target of protected areas 30 by 30. This is not something that decided by our communities where it will be create most significant impacts, but it was decided by some other non-government organizations, and these non-government organizations, they are most unaccountable and non-transparent than the most unaccountable and transparent government in the world. So, and this, it will be probably included in post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And what will happen, I think we have some indication in Costa Rica, even before adoption of this global biodiversity framework based on 30% protected area, the fishermen in Costa Rica are already facing this implementation, and they are very concerned that their responsible fishing areas and other local governance practices will be ruined. Yeah, I think this is something probably I will be most interested to hear on, or probably taking part in other discussions also. If this new protected area target is helping us anyway, the main concerns of our ecological crisis and climate crisis, or it is just another large scale, huge land governance project that is not based on our decision and not for our local biodiversity conservation or protecting our livelihoods. Thanks. Yeah.
So I would, thanks for that. I would add to the discussion there, is this a useful contribution to some of these kind of potential or promising approaches to ocean governance? And the Pacific is another example that is not being appreciated or built on enough. This would be similarly, it's based on constructive use of existing rights in a totally different context of the ocean at large and huge stocks of migratory tuna, which up until now have been managed under various UN and regional mechanisms, which haven't been helping the countries that through which the tuna swim particularly. But about 10 years ago, basically a community of countries in the Pacific got together, the ones through which the tuna swim mainly, 8 countries, and they negotiated a common approach, essentially forming a cartel, meaning that anybody that wants to fish in the richest tuna fishing grounds in the world has to negotiate access to them in block. In other words, bidding for access. And this has worked out very well. They've gone from receiving about 5% of the value of the tuna in terms of license fees to about 25%. And using regional scientific bodies, they have been able to maintain a sufficient science base to ensure that the fishing is sustainable. So some of these countries are getting up to 70% of their national revenue from their most abundant and most precious resource, which is a huge turnaround from before. But this was not necessarily in the interests of the distant water fishing nations. This was not in the interests of many of the other partners in the region. And so it's been immensely tricky to A, set up, and B, keep it going. So, you know, there's a lot of enemies, some of them not too distant from me here today, that would love to see the system going back to the previous one, where those 500 million euros a year didn't go to the countries, but went to other parts of the market chain. So we have self-interest as well. The 30% in this situation has absolutely no contribution to make whatsoever, because these are tuna that swim around. So what we can see from all of the maps of fishing effort at the moment is that fishing boats just concentrate on the edge of any MPA, waiting for the tuna to come out the other side. And so, in fact, potentially the impact hasn't been assessed adequately yet, but if you remove 30% of the EEZs of all the participating countries, it may well break the cartel. They may no longer have sufficient control over the tuna for it to be interesting for the fishing nations to pay or bid for access. So there's a bit of a concern there. Also, MPAs are extremely expensive to enforce, particularly if they're far offshore and you are a small island developing state with barely enough money to keep your health system going, let alone $100,000 patrol boat trips to distant MPAs. So that would be my penultimate, second to final note on the 30 by 30. I'll pass back to Arju.
Yeah, I think you could, or probably you will at the next time, that discuss more about how marine protected areas in our regions, they are putting our communities between what I say that a rock and a hard place. Because at the first place, the processes of local governance, traditional and customary governance, is not just important for some kind of traditional romanticism or that, but as you have said, this is about doing more with the less, and also acknowledging the agency of our local resource users and the environmental stewards who are the artisanal and subsistence additional fishers, is for the long term defending these ecosystems and sustaining this ecosystem in a long term. Because our experience, for example, in Bangladesh or other Bay of Bengal countries, is marine protected areas, not in a conspiratory way, but the process is set in a way that marine protected areas work in this region as accessory to unsustainable development, unsustainable maritime economic activities. Because when you enclose an area, a sea, and you strip the local communities their rights to access the resources, this is what happened. And I'm sorry if I'm going back to history once again, but these are the way we came here today. There's a very sometimes looked over connection about this kind of global exploratory initiative originated in the West, and the relationship with the local economy and of course the environmental commons. If you remember, just 5 or 6 years after the Portuguese seafarer, the private companies, they found or they discovered the route to India. Just after 5 or 6 years, I don't remember, probably 6 years, we had a state in India that's called Portuguese State of India. And this state was not a vast undivided area, but it was enclosure of near shore and coastal areas, offshore islands. I think probably like 2 dozens of most important ports, factories, fortified to establish the monopoly on trades and so on. But I think this is, and what's important is all this happened not just like a bad exploration or adventure, but this was like today. The 30 by 30 target, you will see that this is a very honorable thing to do for many NGOs, because this is about the responsibility to conserve, they say. And how we came to this, before that, it was the obligation to civilize. And even before that, it was the right to colonize. And it was an honorable thing to say that we have the right to colonize. So we are establishing this Portuguese state of India. It evolved. But at the end of the day, I always, I think I get back to this idea of, if we don't have this procedural justice, we don't have distributive justice. So if our marine areas, coastal areas today, we don't get to decide how we use it, because we did something right. Otherwise, how else in most large parts of the world we sustained and defended this ecosystem? How? That means we did something right. So I think we have this right to decide for ourselves, and marine protected area gets in the way. For example, in Seychelles, I think conclude with that, a horrific things happen. In my personal opinion, I am not representing any of the organization I work with right now, but this is my very personal observation, that a large, big, fat marine protected area was established without any consultation or consideration or a stake of the local fishers. And the things that horrified me was it was touted as a success because the sovereign debt of a sovereign nation was transferred to a non-government organization. The kind of debt which at the first place should have been, abolished, because this is the continuity of the colonial exploitation, and the debt come from there, the Paris Club countries. But then conservation group, they bought these debt bonds from France or some other Paris Club countries with the commitment that they will do a marine protected area. But there's no guarantee that in a marine protected area, later there will not be deep sea mining, there will not be militarization of the areas, there will not be other unsustainable economic activities. You don't have any guarantees. But what is guaranteed by marine protected area is you cut off the traditional relationship, the ownership, the sense of ownership, the intergenerational learning of the fishers, of the coastal communities. So when this thing will come to take over your so-called marine protected area, these communities will not be there, because their generations, they will have to at least live somehow. And this happened in some of the Bay of Bengal countries, where there was a marine protected area, the communities was driven off, and then we now have underdeveloping, under construction ports and other this kind of mega infrastructures. So I think this might be uncomfortable for many of us who we work in conservation to talk about, because large NGOs and other conservation groups are involved. But I think we can't avoid it anymore. There's no avoiding it anymore to talk about more decolonized conservation and how marine protected area is not helping us in any ways to address our ecological crisis and the climate crisis we are in.
Yeah, I'll just follow on from that in keeping us in the uncomfort zone, because of course the propaganda or the push for the 30 by 30 is a little bit of a conflict of interest for many NGOs who in developing countries claim to have the biggest expertise on how to do MPAs. And so there is a bit of a concern I have there, but I think the biggest concern I've got is that it's taking the focus off the things that we do need help with. So we have seen how communities given a little bit of support, or in fact just left alone, can actually look after their futures quite well. And so we need to ask, a bit like Arju was asking, what did we actually need? Well, we need governments to control or regulate the corporations that are constantly doing things that undermine the natural resource base of communities and that communities cannot do anything about. We have mining, we have logging that are and industrial fishing that somehow have better access to even our governments in the islands, the developing country governments, or even European governments. And these are not being regulated as much as the imposition of protected areas regimes and so on is on the local people. I mean, that's what we would like to see, the immense lobbying power of NGOs taking on. Let's take on subsidies for industrial fleets. Let's take on governments being very lax in terms of enforcement of environmental impact assessments and so on. Don't pretend that logging is a necessary evil. It could be managed far better, but it's not being managed better. And there's nothing that communities can do about that. And of course, the biggest threat of all is the current economic regime, which leads to climate change and overexploitation and biodiversity loss. These are the big challenges that are outside of the hands of local communities and us as people who work with local communities. Let's hope that the governments are not being allowed to skip their duties on that front in exchange for this strange and very unequal 30% bandwagon. Over to you for some final thoughts on that, Arju.
I think we're almost running out of time. Yeah, I will just remind us that probably rather than spending our resources and focus and time and about this kind of area-based exclusionary conservation target, we should focus more on helping these communities who are at the front line of climate crisis and global biological crisis. For example, the subsistence and artisanal fishing communities, helping them on their own terms, not having a prescription of for example, MPS in your pocket before coming to these communities, but helping these communities to secure their collective rights, basic human rights, tenure rights, so that they can be the stewards again, they can revive their traditional governance systems. And of course, I think particularly about the post-2020 biodiversity framework, which will significantly define the conservation in the near future. We should also demand and talk about human rights-based financing, rather than giving money directly to government for exclusionary marine protected areas. We should have human rights-based financing directly to these communities for the stuff, the kind of capacity building and other stuff these communities want to do. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So Maniba, over to you. Oops.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, I'm so fired up with what the two of them have just said, and I thought that, oh, why am I boxed in a presentation? So anyway, I'm going to be giving a presentation, so I'll share my screen and hope all of it works. Can you see my presentation?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm really fired up when Muhammad started talking about we don't want to go back to history, we don't want to talk about colonialism, we don't want to talk about, remind us about that. I think it's so important to remind us about that. Good morning. People who are at the museum, I'm an hour ahead of you, talking to you from Cape Town, close to the southernmost tip of Africa. And yeah, your explorers from Portugal via the church came in the 1400s down to the Cape to plant some roots here, or went astray because of the storm, what we call the Cape of Storms. So I'm going to bring some of that into my presentation, but also I want to talk about surplus people in park spaces and oceans, and particularly the view from small-scale fishers in marine protected areas. And then I also want to talk about around convivial conservation and spatial politics, bringing those debates into what we're talking about. So ocean exploration around the African coast for scientific, commercial, religious, military, territory, trade, capitalism, exploitation, and enclosures, in many ways, colonialism is part of what we say, if we go back to history, is the Blue Revolution. And the Blue Revolution in terms of oceans is situated in ocean exploration. And this started in the 1400s already. If we fast forward to the current situation, we are talking about the blue economy. And in your previous presentation, some was alluded to the blue economy and marine spatial planning, which is the focus of extractive resources, and also in marine protected areas around oil, gas, seabed mining. Under the frame of sustainable development goals, on the one hand, we want to kind of look at resources of oil, gas, and seabed mining. And on the other hand, we want to look at ecotourism for elite and adventure, hotel development in marine protected areas. So I want to talk about blue justice for small-scale fisheries in MPAs, and why we need to rethink, reform, and reimagine conservation by connecting the land and sea in our narratives. So I start with the African coast, and we're looking at small-scale fisheries, and we see that 200 million people around the coast are part of small-scale fisheries, and this provide food access in terms of via land. And a lot of these access are constrained by marine protected areas. We speak about people in terms of their rights, their right to livelihood, their right to be recognized, their right for food and nutrition, and also their right to kind of protest. And in the center here, you see some of the kind of activism around fisheries that in South Africa, more particularly, as to if there is no fish, there is this threaten their food security and also their livelihoods. It's also important to mention that changes has happened in terms of more focus on the human rights, and soft law has been created for this sector. But the soft law can only be implemented once government implement that. So there's a lot of threats for women. Most of the fish are exported on the continent, and most of the fish are exported, and the fish on this side is moved away from communities, and very little is left behind. So when we're thinking about the threat of food security, food sovereignty, we talk about marine protected areas, we're talking about rights, we have to look at it in a quite holistic way, that they are a bundle of struggles and issues that the sector around the continent basically engage in and are faced with. And these struggles are mainly situated within the blue economy. So what I have been trying to work out in the last couple of years is to kind of call for a blue justice for small-scale fisheries. And this is because I have seen how small-scale fisheries on the continent are where a conservation is seen, and we've heard via NGOs, as a form of accumulation. All the money that has been spent on conservation, foundation money that has been spent on conservation is another form of accumulation. There's been a lot of elite and adventure tourism, selling of paradise, and in that way excluding people whose lives and livelihoods are part of were always part in these areas. So it's proclaiming a marine protected area, forcing people from their access to their livelihoods and also land, and bring in hotel development via elite tourism. And in many cases, they are a result of conflict and criminalizing of livelihoods. So suddenly a new permit, a new rule, laws are being created where people are not accessing their livelihoods, and this is in marine protected areas. You find shootings and killings by park officials if fishermen go into marine protected areas. You also find fishers responding by poaching or illegal fishing as a form of protest to respond to that. And this happens in many cases in marine protected areas, marine spatial planning. And I think it is very important that we look at thinking about what are the counter narratives to conservation, and also in terms of the blue economy. So bringing all of that in, it is not as if we are saying that small-scale fishers do not have the agency, or they have the right to protest. So protests happened, organizations happened, new policies have been created in soft law. They have been organized at scale internationally, and also been trying to kind of feed into policies to protect them. And it seems like I think that one should not put too much faith in the role of the state, because the state in many of our countries on the continent are corrupt. So money that would go via the state is not coming to communities. And these are the surplus people in the debates on the blue economy, and also the debates on marine protected areas. So we look at how nature is portrayed in the St. Lucia World Heritage Site on the east coast of South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, and as an example of declaring marine protected areas where fishes were excluded to preserve nature and to cater for elite tourism. And of course, obviously protecting species. So Sabelo Mzeleni, a fisherman and who's also a activist from Coastal, explained the challenges that they are living with in this World Heritage Site that has been declared a few years after our democracy in 1994, which is a popular local and international tourist area to see wildlife, birds, sea turtles, and on a day-to-day basis are facing violations of human rights of these park officials, to the extent that many of the fishes have been killed in this area. Another example is closer to the Cape Agulhas area. This is the southernmost part of Africa. And this area around here becomes a marine protected area. And it is open for weapons testing, but not for small-scale fishers to fish in this area. So protected area under the apartheid state of South Africa has also been used as a tool of exclusion for local people. And fishers would state, if a marine protected area is there to protect marine resources, how can weapons be tested in a protected area? So it is this issue of exclusion and the negative impact marine protected areas was documented in some of my work from 2012 already. On the other hand, this is a short film that I was producing where women who are living close to the coast without rights are part of are almost engaging and coerced by poachers, because that next to them is a high value species. And this is also in a community area where outsiders and criminalization of areas of livelihoods are lured in poor people's lives. I think it is very important that we have to now look at, if we look at what is the issue in terms of blue justice, we look at biodiversity, conservation, and inequality. How do we respond to this global decline of biodiversity while addressing the inequalities and alienation of human nature relations that continue and characterize this region of Southern Africa. Many conservation actors realize that taking these challenges requires seriously systemic redesign of the sector, but it lacks a vision supported by evidence to conceptualize, to organize and fund conservation differently. So we've been playing with this with colleagues Bram Pusher, who's also who's based in the Netherlands, but he's also one could say is a South African. He's been working here for many years. So convivial conservation is what is this vision, an approach that moved beyond mainstream approaches and centered around protected areas. And also what Mohammed has been talking in his last sentence about addressing the market mechanism of biodiversity crisis by reconnecting humans and also living spaces. This is the article that he wrote with Rob Fletcher, but there's also some, if you kind of Google this, you'll see how they explain convivial conservation. So what we would want to do in South Africa and test convivial conservation is this is an African pot, we call it a potjie. It's a 3-leg, and we want to kind of cook up convivial conservation in action so that it just not becomes a concept that we can't really root in. And for this concept to cook, we need research and training. We also need network and technology. And we also need, out of the pot, need policy, advocacy, communication campaign, and also to look at justice, bringing blue justice into community action, and also spatial justice in terms of this. So this is a form of what we would want to say that we want to disrupt. We want to transform conservation and reimagine conservation in Southern Africa. And in terms of this, we are very excited that we are launching a project on living landscapes in action, linking land and ocean conservation, where our overall goal is to kind of look at effective convivial conservation and develop evidence campaigning and coalition in a systemic and redesigned conservation sector in South Africa. Southern Africa has also been roots of pulling together conservation outside agenda, although there have been very successful conservation practices before industrialization of our areas. It is not necessarily that these practices have been forming part of decision-making. We're talking about co-management, we're talking about community management, but it's often top-down. So we really want to kind of go back and investigate and work and live with communities to understand and evidence-based and area-based as to documenting this kind of process, but also to kind of think that, okay, documenting is one, evidence is the other, democratization of conservation is important, but what about finance? Finance becomes a critical part of how conservation finance flows need to be redirected to think about a conservation basic income grant. So we draw on the social literature and social welfare literature on the basic income grant that is a hot topic internationally in terms of when we're looking at poor people and in terms of social welfare. I think it is important if we want to look at convivial conservation and MPAs. MPAs is it's rooted in a fortress conservation of exclusion, without people, without fishers and women being arrested and harassed and beaten. The need to separate fisheries management at community level from criminal aspects is also important, because whatever models of fisheries management tools are not applying to small-scale fisheries. And I think if we want to kind of think that marine protected areas need to flourish more freely and people need to be part of this, it is also important that we need to transform the economy when we do this. Apologies for all the text here, but I have 3 key messages that I want to end off with. I think it is important, the importance of sustainable conservation of natural resources, and those leading the blue economy agenda at national and international level have been accused of doublespeak, leveraging the term of ecological crisis narrative in order to distract people from implementing free market policies and questionable public value. This blue economy approach is just a resurgence of fortress conservation, in which the interest and the rights of local community in accessing nature would be restricted. So there's a hidden agenda around this blue economy and what it is, and also linked to an ecological crisis narrative that we must be very careful of. I think it is also important that large-scale investors with national governments are increasingly marginalizing people and shaping the development agenda. I was happy that Mohammed mentioned the debt for marine protected area swap in the Seychelles. I'm shocked to also say that the governments of Kenya, Tanzania, and others are looking very closely how we can get money out of selling ocean space to conservation organization, and that model is really problematic. I think it's also important that we need to kind of relook at bringing social justice approach into the interest and the rights of people, communities, fishers, in terms of these nature deals that have been struck in marine territories. And also we must be mindful of the domestic elites. Governments are corrupt, and the intermediaries that are part of this. Thank you. That is my final comment. I will stop share.
Thank you so much to all 3 of you. What an amazingly rich array of contexts and histories and problematics and dynamics that are woven through this whole story that I think are very, very rarely seen by most people who have a common interest in conservation issues. You know, to actually understand the colonial legacies of the problems, the structural drivers of the problems, and the ways in which many of these approaches are complicated and tied up with all sorts of other resource and economic interests, which are very concealed, I think, as you pointed out, through ecological crisis narratives around this sort of honorable moral economy, Mohammed, that you mentioned, that manages to conceal all sorts of other things that perhaps aren't even necessarily clear to large NGOs themselves. And actually I wanted to, I think, just start there, which was with the large conservation NGOs who, like you say, are being kind of granted de facto access to managing huge parts of sovereign territory in the name of global conservation frameworks. And I was just wondering if any of you could, well, perhaps Arju, perhaps you could say something about this. Yeah, if your impression of what the conservation NGOs really think that they're doing, and is there a sense of these problems, and how are they trying to get around, you know, what they can see as kind of exclusions for small-scale fishers, and how do they also manage the complexities with these differentiated forms of access, you know, with still granting access to mining rights and large industrial fishers, but of course excluding smaller scale participants. So if you could just say something about that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Louis. I personally, I will not assume any bad faith as such on the part of conservation NGOs. I am not, of course, accusing in any way that they are involved in any conspiracies or so on, because we can see this through. It's more about the total power relationship with these big international NGOs and the government in, say, in the tropical regions, and also the whole mandate of these conservation groups. Because if the mandate is to follow some metrics that was decided by the interest of colonial footage conservation, then it doesn't matter how well-intentioned you are, because for the most part, the conservation, these sense and the whole paradigm of conservation, the responsibility to conserve the world by Western NGOs, big international NGOs, assume that, or at least vanishes from the landscape, that people in other parts of the world, they did not have any type of local governance systems, or they can't imagine other type of relationships also. For example, if we take this 30 by 30 target of protected areas and other area-based conservation measures, all the NGO activities invested behind it is about bringing on board, securing buy-in from governments. There was no discussions with community groups or organizations who are involved in social justice, like groups of fisher folks and other fish workers or cooperatives, but they already have some metrics. So I think I get what you are saying, that if the conservation NGOs are well-intentioned, how this is happening. I will conclude with just one point. We have some discussions with many of the conservation groups at some points. What happens is there's some kind of like helplessness on the part of the conservation groups also, they say, because of the priority of the funders who are giving the money. And they're saying that the funders want a very, what they say, the tangible metrics, that these hectares, acres of areas are protected from the native people or from the resources users. And my question will be, these metrics of conservation, how you measure what the successes are in conservation, was not discovered, was not defined by the funders. These metrics of conservation, of successes of conservation in footage conservation, was also developed and defined in the Western science-based academia and also by the conservation groups. So I think the question, more important question is how these conservation groups will go forward by fundamentally restructuring how they operate, how the relationship with the governments in countries in, for example, tropical regions, and whether they will look back. You can see that there are the largest conservation group in the world. They don't even want to apologize publicly for the human rights abuses they were involved in. So they are even not too willing to start the process of decolonizing conservation. And I think this is the point these conservation groups can think about, how they can start, at least remove this historical amnesia about how colonialism and nature conservation are linked, and how they want to start, at least start embracing it.
Thank you. It actually reminds me a little bit of this conversation, I think, that you listened into, the one that we had before about the challenges of thinking outside the box, so to speak. And of course, disciplinary boundaries are in themselves kinds of boxes with perhaps limited go-between between them. And I'm still so fascinated about this challenge for conservation NGOs to refuse to see the historical conditions of the arrangements that they're now intervening in. And Muniba, you talked about convivial conservation and the plans that are underway in South Africa, which are forms of strategy, I think. And there's different component parts about building the networks of institutions and actors, and also dealing with research. But could you say a little bit more about how you think this strategic change might come about in the conservation sector, driven by this vision for a kind of decolonizing conservation and convivial approaches?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that, Southern Africa is the place where fortress conservation and the resurgence of fortress conservation is really happening, both in terms of marine protected areas and on land. And I think it is an ideal place to start thinking how to kind of strategically change this process. For one, I think the concept is exciting, and it makes us start. I think also there's a lot of people in conservation spaces that knows that we have dismally failed. But where are how can we do things different? And I think what we want to do is not to kind of just come up with the solution, but to really look at a process of starting conversations in terms of conservation areas, but also that conservation areas should not just only be in protected areas, it should also be coming into urban areas, so that urban spaces can also become more greener. And we shouldn't just kind of package it in that way. It is so important that training of people in the space of implementing conservation is going to be an important part. And this is not necessarily academic training. These are in form of short course training of officials to come on board and to kind of understand how to think differently and how to implement. So it becomes an issue of looking at training, looking at research, working in a participatory and a strategic way with local communities. And also it is important that we have to get people who are in these spaces of fortress conservation to also rethink and reimagine, because it's not only those who you can align with that thinks the same. And big international NGOs like WWF, Conservation International, I think is also important to have them on board in this wave. So I think it is it's an exciting start of a process of looking at how to do this in a 3-year phase, and not really looking, as what Mohammed is saying, looking at immediate successful cases and how to show that this is a successful case, but really really work and understand also what you're stepping in community is also that you step in politics, elite politics. We also have in many spaces in South Africa traditional authorities that comes with other dynamics that we need to understand. So I think it is exciting that we have to look at it in almost as if you develop a campaign of how to kind of rethink and reimagine this with content. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a complicated thing to change an entire institutional movement, and of course the ways of seeing things and understanding things, and education and is going to be central, I think, to that. But of course, I mean, the background to all of this is, perhaps we haven't even talked about, is the degree to which MPAs are actually effective on a biological level to be securing, you know, restoration of marine ecologies and things. And I mean, would anyone else like to comment about that a little bit? This sort of the intricate nature, I think, of the ways that ocean space is used and by local people, and the assumption that removing them is necessary for marine conservation, and that, of course, that conservation might not be so effective in the first place. Hugh, perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about the sort of effectiveness of marine protected areas on a biological, you know, basis.
Yes, well, I mean, that's probably one of the starting points, because it is absolutely a tool, and the debate or the definition of marine protected areas has been evolving over the last 20 or 30 years. The tool makes sense, but it's particularly well suited to biodiversity conservation. In other words, the best thing to do to preserve biodiversity is to stop killing it. And probably 100% of it should be protected if that's all you're worried about. But we're talking about the CBD, we're talking about policy environments where it's not just about biodiversity. In the second, you've got to worry about feeding people, justice, et cetera, then you can't just choose the best biodiversity tool. We need to figure out tools that address the biggest threats and that have the best the reverse of bang per buck, benefit per buck for your societies. And that's what's just completely gobsmacking to me at this stage in our human evolution, is for us to be going from saying or learning at university 30 or 40 years ago about ecosystem approaches and integrated management, to be going back to talking only about one single conservation tool in determining how we manage very complex situations in very different countries. The other thing is the colonialism reeks throughout of all of this, because it may well be that in highly developed countries with long histories of investment in regulating environmental impacts from pollution and from mining and logging and so on and so forth, that they are now at the stage where the only tool left that they can use to reverse the downward trends is protecting the last sort of vestiges, the last Yellowstone parks or whatever. But this is the mentality that's being foisted on the rest of the world, most of it developing. In many countries, there isn't resources to do the basic environmental regulation, which everybody in the developed world would take for granted. So yes, protected areas, certainly they have a place, they work. But are they the tool for a place which doesn't have any other environmental regulation at all? Easy for them to say.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really nice place to end, because we're at time as well. But I want to thank you all very much for joining us today. I've learned a lot, and I hope the audience has too, about complexifying this conversation and showing us the depth and the history to all of these challenges. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you soon.